We last had a conversation amongst us three at a similar event 5 years ago, and a few things have changed in the world since then, and we want to, over the next 40 minutes or so, review some of them and get your perspectives on them. The overarching theme of our event is the Great Transition, and clearly great transitions are happening all around us. Our conversation has been happening against the background of very difficult events in the Middle East, of course. And if I could start with you, Prime Minister, to ask, Greece abstained in the UN resolution this week on a ceasefire. Would you like to explain that decision and your thinking behind that?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be able to have this discussion with Professor Fukuyama, whom I respect very much. Indeed, the last time we met on stage was in 2018, and I think a lot has happened since. Maybe we'll have a chance to review how Greece and the world has changed during our discussion. But first of all, let me clarify that during the UN vote, Greece aligned itself with the majority of European countries. We have been very clear from the beginning in stating the obvious, that Israel has a right to defend itself, but always in accordance with international law. And we have expressed our deep concern for the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and we've encouraged all parties to ensure that humanitarian corridors, but also humanitarian pauses, can be put in place in order for aid to reach those who are mostly affected. We need to be very, very clear in stipulating that Hamas is a terrorist organization, that it does not speak on behalf of the Palestinian people, and that the only legitimate interlocutor when it comes to the Palestinian people is the Palestinian Authority, which currently runs the West Bank. To that extent, we've tried to modify the resolution, but we were not able to include crucial elements which we think reflect our position. Hence, we decided to abstain. And I think that the abstention is probably in line with the overall position of the European Union as it was expressed in the most recent statement of the European Council.
And being aligned with Europe is obviously an important factor in all this. Is there a role for specific Greek diplomacy in this crisis, or is it mostly going to be conducted through the European, the greater power of the European Union?
We were one of the few countries that were both present in the peace initiative convened by President Sisi in Cairo, but also visiting Israel. I had a chance to visit and discuss with Prime Minister Netanyahu the situation on the ground. And I think Greece is uniquely positioned for two reasons. First of all, we are, with Cyprus, the closest country to the Middle East. We have a strategic partnership with Israel, but we're also very well respected within the Arab world. In that sense, I think we are objective when it comes to our overall policy. In recognizing, the basic principles which I previously described, but also in bringing it to the forefront what in my mind can only be, the ultimate solution to the Palestinian problem, which is somehow reviving what we term as a two-state solution, which is essentially the right of the Palestinians to have their own state without compromising the safety of Israel, and of course the right of the Jewish people to call Israel their homeland. And I think that is why we have the ability to talk to everyone in the region. Of course, we don't talk to Hamas, nor do we aspire to do that, because we are very clear in terms of defining Hamas as a terrorist organization. And there is no way one can imagine resolving this crisis without a strategic defeat of Hamas. I'm careful, and I'm not talking about eradication of Hamas, but I'm talking about the necessity for Hamas to be defeated. But at the same time, let me repeat how concerned I am with the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We are talking to several European countries, but also to the United States, also to the United Nations, if there's a role for us to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza by sea, given that we are with Cyprus, one of the closest countries, we'd be very, very happy to do that. The problem with Gaza now is that the humanitarian assistance that is necessary is significant. Only a fraction of that assistance actually makes it into Gaza, which makes it absolutely essential that the focus should be on getting humanitarian assistance into Gaza and to ensure that civilian casualties are limited to the maximum possible extent. One needs also to be very clear that we are in a very difficult, sort of unique situation where Hamas is using innocent people as human shields. On the other hand, Israel is a democratic state. The rules of engagement of a democracy cannot be the same as the rules of engagement of a terrorist organization. That's why the bar is much higher when it comes to what we expect from Israel in terms of managing what is a very, very complicated and difficult situation.
And you spoke about the need to defeat Hamas. Assuming that were to happen, who then becomes the interlocutor for the Palestinians?
That is a very good question and a topic that we have also discussed at the European Council. I don't think it is too late to start discussing the future of Gaza and who can actually administer Gaza, assuming that Hamas is no longer in the picture. Of course, I'm not stating something which is not well known to your audience. The Palestinian Authority has not demonstrated maximum effectiveness in terms of managing the affairs of the Palestinian people in the West Bank, and this is also one of the problems that we're facing. But I think one thing is certain, that we will try to play a role as a pillar of stability in the region, and we will also try to respect our alliances while being fair and just when it comes to addressing what is objectively a very complicated situation.
And you say it's not too soon to start thinking, about the day after the conflict is over. Is it your understanding, or have you been involved in kind of a creative search for what that might look like? There's quite a bit of thinking about what it might look like. Are you actively engaged?
Well, let me limit myself to saying that I've been engaged in several discussions on this topic.
Okay. Let's broaden out the perspective a little bit with you, Professor Fukuyama, to look at the sort of world that this is reflecting. A very different world, certainly than we had a few decades ago when you wrote The End of History, a very different world even 5 years ago when we were last discussing here. What sort of world do you think we're moving towards? Is it bipolar, multipolar, some entirely new kind of model?
Well, before I answer your question, I would like to point out that Prime Minister Mitsotakis was a graduate of the Stanford Master's Program that I run. I tried to invite him. I tried to invite him to a 40th anniversary alumni event in May, but I believe at that time he was a little bit busy with an election or something like that, so we didn't get him to come back to Stanford. But I'm very honored to be able to be on the panel with him. So I think that one of the biggest changes in the world over that 5-year period was really the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because I don't think that anybody really took the possibility of a big conventional war, and certainly not one in Europe, seriously prior to that point. I think that we were still living in a world where, you could pressure people, you could use political, you could use economic sanctions and various other kinds of instruments. But to actually take an army and march it across a well-established international border simply did not seem like something that was done. And many people thought that that kind of mentality was spreading to the Middle East as well. And I think Vladimir Putin showed that, unfortunately, we are still living in this 19th, 20th century world in which that kind of overt military aggression can take place. And, this, for example, also triggered a lot of thinking in East Asia. I don't think that anyone in Taiwan really took seriously the possibility that China could do to Taiwan what Russia was trying to do to Ukraine. And now they do. And they're very worried about it. And so, that's part of the backdrop. And I think mentally, many people in the West are still not there. They still don't appreciate the fact that, for example, we've got a big problem with our defense industrial base. We don't produce enough ammunition. We don't produce enough rockets. And if there is an expansion of the existing conflicts, particularly to something going on in East Asia, we're going to run out of bullets, in fairly short order. And so I think a lot of the, it doesn't please me to say this, but I think a lot of the mentality of the past 30 years has unfortunately got to shift gears into something that does accept the possibility of this kind of conflict. Now, what makes it particularly dangerous is its multipolar nature. You have a kind of broad alignment between Europe, the United States, Japan, Canada, and an axis, China, Russia, Iran. It's not ideological because these are not really ideologically aligned countries, but there's a broad division of the world. But the problem is there are many middle powers now. There are many actors that cannot be controlled. A lot of people in Washington, London, Moscow want to think that everything is the result of one of the other great powers manipulating these smaller actors, but they're independent, We don't know really what the relation between Iran and Hamas was. Did the Iranians really push them at this particular moment to do something? We simply don't know. It's entirely possible they're acting on their own, but that means that a resolution of the conflict becomes that much harder, and the possibility of escalation also becomes much greater.
So I want to ask, well, you both actually, let's take some of the things you've mentioned in turn. First Russia, then perhaps China by implication, and then the middle powers. I think all are really interesting. On Russia, are you concerned that the events of the past 3 weeks have distracted attention from the need to support Ukraine, the cohesion of that effort, which was already under some strain?
I'm definitely worried about it because in Washington they can't really handle two big crises simultaneously. It is going to distract both resources and attention. And so there's no question that Ukraine, I think, is going to suffer as a result of this. And so it also becomes part of American domestic politics because we're in this bizarre situation where the Republican Party is very pro-Israel but very anti-Ukraine all of a sudden. And so we can't really deal with that constellation of crises in a coherent way because the domestic support base for doing things in different parts of the world are different. And it's really not good for Ukraine.
Prime Minister, could you give your view on this and the sense of, or give a sense of how solid the continued support for Ukraine is? Perhaps more in Europe than in America, but even in Europe, you have Mr. Orban, for example, being friendly with Mr. Putin. So how does it look from your perspective?
If you look at the conclusions of the recent European Council, you will realize that we started by reiterating our commitment to support Ukraine and to ensure that this European alliance remains completely united. And if we were to turn the clock back, this was not obvious. And I think it took a lot of effort from all of us to ensure that we make a very clear statement by supporting Ukraine. And this, I think, is a statement that resonates beyond Ukraine. Because at the end of the day, this is not just about Russia and Ukraine. It's about sending a message to anyone contemplating a violation of sovereign borders that they will have to pay a very, very significant price. This is, of course, also relevant for Greece in particular, as I explained when I articulated our clear and unequivocal support for Ukraine at the very beginning of this conflict. So I think that in terms of the politics, the front is going to remain united. Yes, there will be some voices here and there, but not enough to change the parameters of the coalition. There may be more sanctions, but I think Professor Fukuyama is right to point out that at the end of the day, the bulk of the military support is coming from the United States. So the position that the US will take is going to be critical. I think the war also highlighted some of the fallacies that we may have developed regarding the future of warfare. This is not all going to be about, cyber and drones and unmanned vehicles. This is a traditional, almost trench warfare that for us who have an interest in history reminds us probably more of World War I than anything than World War II, with tons of shelling. And this highlights also the fact that when we looked at our own defense industry and our defense capability in Europe, it is clear that we need to do more. So this notion of European strategic autonomy, which is, in my mind, not independent of our relationship within NATO, but certainly worth pursuing, is something that we need to contemplate as Europeans much more seriously. Now, Greece is a country that is spending more than 3% of its GDP on defense, and we've done so for many years, and we've paid the fiscal price of doing so. So one of the topics that we're currently discussing when we're looking at the future of the Stability and Growth Pact and the new fiscal rules is related to whether we can actually exempt defense spending from excessive budget calculations in order to encourage countries to spend more on defense, because defense is so critical for our liberty and our sovereignty. That is why I think we need to look at the broader context of what Europe can do, not just politically, but also in terms of hardcore defense capabilities. That's a discussion we're having at the European Council. For example, in Greece, it's an opportunity for our own defense industry, which has not performed particularly brilliantly over the past decades, to get its act together. And of course, always encouraging our teams to learn from what has happened. We need to learn from Ukraine. What are the warfare lessons from Ukraine? And of course, we also need to learn from what is happening even in the Middle East, and how could it be that the strongest army and the strongest intelligence mechanism certainly in the region was unable to foresee what actually happened.
And there's potentially a kind of fresh element in all this, which is the potential urgency of Europe to step up to a far greater extent than it has done before. So I guess in line with what you're saying of the strategic autonomy and being, in your view, compatible with NATO, while not desirable, it may have some sort of beneficial impact if it spurs Europe into action. Is that your view?
Yes, and what we saw, and we've seen it actually, I would say even during the times of the previous administration, which was pushing Europeans sometimes in a very not particularly polite manner to spend more on defense. What we see is now that all European countries are beginning to spend more on defense, and that this notion that there is a peace dividend, we don't need to spend much on defense because we can use the money to spend it on schools or social services or pensions. That was, in our complicated world, that is, a fallacy. States need to be sovereign. States need to have the capability to defend themselves, and the European Union needs to be able to pool resources to defend our European interests in the best possible manner.
Do you think, just to push that a little bit further, if you got that same administration back again, which is conceivable, that presumably the pressure would be there again for Europe to spend more on defense? Do you think you could sell it as a success for a second Trump administration that NATO Europe was spending more on defense?
I'm experienced enough not to make any predictions about the outcome of the U.S. elections that could get me into trouble. So what I can point out, is that certainly Greece and the U.S., we have a strategic partnership that I think transcends specific administrations. Personally, I've worked both with President Trump and President Biden. We have a new defense and cooperation agreement that has been put in place. We have bipartisan support in Congress about the strategic importance of Greece as a pillar of stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we've opened up Greece to significant amount of U.S. investment, so we've broadened this relationship to add an economic dimension. So I want to look at the institutional component of our relationship, and I think that this is a relationship which is very solid and will only go from strength to strength.
I can say something that the Prime Minister can't. If Donald Trump is elected in 2024, it is going to be a disaster for Europe. It's going to be a disaster because it was clear that he wanted to pull out of NATO. He likes Russia better than Ukraine. He's a friend of all of the new rising populist parties. You know, he's a good friend of Viktor Orban. And I think his support for all of the institutional structures that were created after 1945 is non-existent. So I just pray that that's not going to happen.
I'm glad you were so nuanced on that question, Frank. But, if I could turn to a question where there is perhaps, in fact, bipartisanship in America these days, and it's China. In many respects, there is broad agreement across the aisle on China as a strategic rival, a strategic threat to America. How is this emerging rivalry taking shape, do you think, and how about the way that China is playing both its relationship with Russia and now, in more recent times, the crisis in the Middle East?
Well, I think this is a bad relationship whose deterioration is very largely due to China's behavior. I don't think that either the past administration or this one went into the relationship hoping that it would end up as nasty as it's become, but I think the Chinese, beginning with the rise of Xi Jinping, imposed an ever more centralized dictatorship within the country, began to shift foreign policy in a very aggressive way in the South China Sea, on the border with India and many other areas. Treatment of its own population, the Uyghurs, violated, commonly held standards of human rights. And so, and the way that Western businesses were treated, I think has convinced a lot of CEOs that, their betting on China was, in the end, they made money for many years, but that period has come to an end. And so I think the disengagement has been limited. I mean, it's focused on certain strategic goods like semiconductors, batteries, that sort of thing. It's not across the board, but I really think that it was a kind of necessary response to China's own behavior. They could have, at the end of COVID, ended all the wolf warrior diplomacy, but they chose to go down a different path.
And nevertheless, China is, a massive power. There are very few problems in the world that can't be solved without an element of Chinese input, not least climate change and environmental issues. China is an important investor in Greece, isn't it? So how is Greece recalibrating or calibrating its relationship with China these days?
China is not an important investor in Greece to the extent that it has made one important investment in the port of Piraeus many years ago, which overall has been a successful investor and has a stake in our main power transmission grid. But apart from that, if you look at the pattern of foreign direct investment into Greece, Greece is certainly not dependent on Chinese capital. Now, my approach is going to be slightly more nuanced than Professor Fukuyama's, in the sense that China is and I'm speaking, looking at it from the European perspective, as a sort of mid-sized European country. China is a rival, a competitor, and a country with which we, at least at the global scale, you need to cooperate in terms of tackling the most important challenges, especially climate change. I'm not sure you can cooperate when it comes to AI, because there's clear rivalry in terms of the technologies that will be developed. Greece is very much defined in terms of its strategic partnerships and its alliances as a member of NATO, but also as a member of the European Union. Having said that, we have bilateral relations with China. I will be going to Beijing on an official visit at the end of this week. But you wouldn't expect me saying things that are different from what most European leaders say when we visit Beijing. And of course, again, looking at the world from the perspective of a European country, my concern, and when I look at our economic performance, is that Europe currently is being squeezed. On the one hand, you have the Chinese state control model with significant state aid to many companies without sort of any restrictions, giving them a significant cost advantage. On the other hand, you have the United States engaged in a very aggressive, I hate to call it protectionist, but certainly supportive policy in terms of its own domestic industrial base. U.S. already coming to the play with an advantage in terms of its energy costs. If you add on top of that, the subsidies given through the Inflation Reduction Act, then I think there is reasonable concern within the European industrial base. Where does this leave us in terms of our competitiveness? And of course, the answer cannot be, in our mind, the fragmentation of the single market, the richer countries simply offering state aid to their companies, because that would mean that the richer countries will be able to do that at the expense of those countries that don't have the fiscal space. So you need a European response to this problem. We've made a first step when it comes to the Recovery and Resilience Facility. That is an important, hugely important milestone in European history, because we've carved out 750 billion euros essentially for the clean and the digital transition. A big chunk of it is going to be used through grants. And for me, the challenge is, how do we make this not necessarily a one-off project, but how do we create more ability for the European Union to be able to offer its competitive base the support that it needs in order to compete from China.
How you use it well.
And of course, I think you're absolutely right to point out that in order for us and for me to sit at the European Council and convince my partners that the RRF should not necessarily be a one-off experiment, because the history of the Next Generation EU started as a response to COVID. But it went way beyond that, is by convincing my European partners that we're actually using the money for the right purpose. And that is why I'm laser focused on making sure that we absorb the money, first of all, and that when we will assess the value that has been created through these funds, there will be a clear positive contribution to the overall performance of the economy. And all my ministers who are here know very well that there is, in my scorecard, there is one item at the very, very top, which myself and the relevant minister is monitoring, and that is compliance with the RRF requirements. Because you miss one milestone, and you have a delay in the whole program. So that is why this is essentially, for me, a test of our ability as Europe to do something beyond what we have already done.
I want to turn to this question of middling powers, medium powers, and perhaps take two of them, both important ones in the current context. One is Iran, and the other is Turkey. So if I turn to you first of all on Iran, do you see Iran staying out of this conflict, or is it going to be, do you think, how big is the risk that it widens to engulf Iran in a much broader regional conflict?
I think the risk is substantial, but I will resist the putting any probability on it, because I just don't think we know. You can see scenarios by which they would show some restraint, because they could get very badly hit in a wider conflict, but they're a very ideological state. So I would say I just don't know what they're going to do in the future.
And with Turkey, can the encouraging signs in Greek-Turkish relations be sustained through the pressures that this crisis is going to put on it?
Well, I would certainly hope so. And at the end of the day, it's, I think, up to Turkey to demonstrate that what we have started to build a relationship of trust based on, clear deliverables can be sustained, because we've always been very consistent in terms of our policy vis-à-vis Turkey, but it's Turkey that has made several U-turns in the past. And of course, it is not easy to carve out space for an improvement in the Greek-Turkish relationship with everything that's happening in our neighborhood. And with President Erdogan in my mind, being on the wrong side of, very open, on the wrong side of history when he refuses, not only does he refuse to condemn Hamas, but he essentially says that there are a liberation movement. That is, something which is may play into his narrative in terms of the role that Turkey can play. But I will certainly try to do my best to make sure that we preserve this positive momentum in the Greek-Turkish relationship, move step by step, make sure that we have clear deliverables, and hope for the best. But at the end of the day, I do need to stress that Greece has always been incredibly consistent in terms of our relationship with Turkey since I took over. And I remember last year when I went the UN during difficult times, and I gave a speech and addressed myself to the Turkish people, explaining to them that we're not the enemy, we're destined by geography to be able to live side by side, and that even if we cannot agree to resolve what has been a very complicated issue to address over the past 40 years, which is essentially the delimitation of our maritime zones, even if we agree to disagree, that can still in international relations be an acceptable way forward. We don't have to be at each other's throats, and we don't have to be the recipients of constant threats regarding our territorial sovereignty. There is also a middle ground, which we have been able to achieve in terms of rapprochement over the past months, and I would just hope that this positive momentum is maintained. I think it would be good in general in this very complicated world, and this certainly very complicated region, if we don't add another source of tension to the equation. We have enough problems in the region.
Frank, you have a view on Turkey?
Not a view on Turkey, but I would like to point out there's some other important middle powers that are playing in the current crisis. So Qatar is the only Gulf state that has been supporting Hamas, but the Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Egypt have no love for Hamas. They don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't like that kind of Islamic radicalism. And it's very interesting to watch them react to the Hamas attack, because they've been very tough and they have not aligned themselves the way Iran, or they haven't even taken the kind of position that Erdogan has taken. So I think that if you're ever going to get a Palestinian voice that can actually live with Israel, that those countries are actually going to have to play an important role in supporting it, because obviously the United States and Israel can't create such a voice. It has to come, from the Arab world itself.
Now, let me add one point which I think is important when you look at the countries in the region. We talk a lot about the hope that this conflict is not going to escalate. I think everyone, including Turkey, I presume, have an interest in this conflict being contained. But I think there's also an additional concern, and that is that important countries in the region don't get destabilized as a result of this conflict. Egypt in particular, and Jordan, two key countries, are faced with significant challenges, economic, social, but at the end of the day, they are, pillars of a regional system of stability that I think we have an interest in terms of maintaining. That's why I've been advocating for years now about the importance of building a stronger European partnership with Egypt, Let me just give you one example. Egypt has 6 million migrants and refugees. There are no boats leaving from Egypt towards Europe. And I don't want to imagine what could happen if a country with a population in excess of 100 million could get destabilized as a result of this conflict. So as much as we need to be concerned about spillover effects, and I think my sense is that there is enough deterrence firepower in the region, I wouldn't say to ensure, but to make it more difficult for this to happen, we should be equally concerned with making sure that we don't cause new sources of instability. And at the end of the day, this overall rapprochement between Israel and the Arab countries, I think overall was and continues to be the right approach. There was just one missing link, that it could not happen at the expense
Do you think
of the Palestinian.
Will happen?
I think eventually it will happen, but there's one missing link. And that missing link was that it cannot happen, and it could not happen at the expense of the Palestinian problem. So one could not, this idea that one can bypass the root cause of the difficulties by forging economic ties, that proved to be a problematic rationale. So I would argue that what was achieved certainly needs to be preserved and strengthened, with the addition of adding a political solution to the Palestinian problem to the negotiating table.
I want to turn to domestic politics in West European and allied countries. We've had several elections in this country, of course. In Poland recently, we have an election coming up in the United States. It's going to be a huge year for elections in 2024. So many elections taking place. How do you see the state of democracy in the place where it is meant to be strongest amidst a lot of polarization, quite alarming polarization in some cases, but also some cases where, despite everything, the center has shown that it can hold? Turn to you first, Frank.
Well, I did not, in 2020, expect to be where we are in 2024. I thought we were done with Donald Trump. But, unfortunately, he has this incredibly strong base that has actually grown the more times he's indicted. And the current poll data indicates that he is certainly holding his own, and some of the polls have him a few points ahead of Joe Biden. And then there are going to be third-party candidates running that will siphon more votes away from Biden than from Trump. So the possibility that Trump could be elected next year is a very significant one. I wouldn't put a probability on, but if you're not worried about it, you're just not paying attention. And it really speaks to some deeper, I think, social disease in the United States that has led to the extreme degree of polarization. Political scientists call it affective polarization, meaning it's not disagreement on policy issues. You really hate the other side. You think that they're a threat to your way of life or to America. And this is a view held really by both sides. And finally, part of Trump's strength is Biden's weakness. Many Americans simply perceive that he's too old. And they don't quite understand that they're not really fighting over policies, they're fighting over democracy itself. The future of American democratic institutions, that's the real stake. But, most Americans say, well, it's just another, campaign, and I kind of like the way that Trump talks at his rallies, and so I'm going to, go with the guy that I think is the stronger. So I'm very worried. I think that even after Trump, even if Biden wins next year's election, that group that he has mobilized is going to be a feature of American politics, and you already see people like Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, all these other Republican hopefuls imitating his slashing, disrespectful, style of politics. And so it's like he's injected a kind of poison into the American political system, and it's going to take a while to flush it out.
So I'm not going to ask you to comment on American politics. You've already said you won't. But what about the European dimension of the health of democracy? How do you see this question of whether the centre can hold, and by the centre I mean the broad spectrum of centre-left, centre-right?
Oh, if you look at Greek politics, I think we have every reason to be slightly more optimistic in the sense that we've proven that a competent centre-right government that focuses on effective problem solving, is inclusive, addresses important, social issues while focusing, on growth. So try to make the growth more inclusive, can actually win a national election with a higher percentage of votes than it got back in 2019. And what's interesting, if you make the comparison, is that in Greece, the populist equivalent of what you described collapsed completely. And it collapsed while they were in the opposition. And that makes it even more interesting because there was no credible alternative. So at the end of the day, Professor Fukuyama has written a lot about the future of liberal democracy, and I encourage you to browse through his recent books. There are certain preconditions, I think, for liberal democracy to make sort of what many would term a comeback, and I think it is a balance between focusing on delivering growth but addressing fundamental grievances, which in my mind are primarily related to inequality. Inequality is the biggest problem that modern societies are facing, and in my mind, the fact that the U.S. is facing these problems is not is clearly related to the fact that it has the highest degrees of inequality of any modern Western democracy. And a lot of the resentments upon which populists feed are real resentments. So we may want to accuse the populists for offering simplistic solutions, for dividing, people. But at the end of the day, you have to understand that the grievances upon which they feed are very, very real and need to be addressed. And I think in this also debate between democracies and authoritarian regimes, it's up to us to also prove that democracies can actually be better at what many thought that authoritarian regimes could do best, which is, deliver on policy outcomes. What I can tell you is that when authoritarian regimes get things wrong, they get it wrong, big time, because there are no checks and balances, there are no controls. There is this sense of supreme power. There is clearly no humbleness or desire to incorporate different opinions. So I think if you look at, of course, every European country is different, but I take a lot of sort of optimism from the Polish election. The Polish election was incredibly important. Why? You had a two-term government which had already succeeded in eroding democratic institutions, which ended up losing a national election to a much more modern and pro-European center-right party, which managed, although it came second in the election, managed to form an alliance that allowed it a comfortable parliamentary majority. Because at the end of the day, it is our duty to protect democratic institutions, to ensure freedom of speech, to make constant improvements when it comes to issues of the rule of law. These things, eventually strengthen our democracy and make our democratic discourse sort of more productive. But we are in an interesting position now where we essentially have one party which is very strong, and all the opposition parties being very fragmented, which certainly places, I would argue, even more obligation upon ourselves to make sure that we deliver on the sort of our electoral manifesto and to honor the trust that people placed in us.
Well, into this mix comes the complicating factor, for better or worse, and you can tell me whether you think it's for better or worse, of new technology in the form of artificial intelligence. So how do you make sure, or seek to make sure, that this is a force for the good and not a huge potential to be exploited by the forces of darkness, if you like?
Well, I must say The Economist published an editorial warning Europe not to try to regulate AI prematurely. And I found myself in great agreement with that. We're at a stage like electricity was in the 1880s. Thomas Edison had just invented the light bulb, and you ask people, what's the consequence of this new invention going to be? You had no idea over the next 100 years. You know, computers, television, radio, all these things didn't exist at that very early point. And I think we're at a very similar point with AI. I actually think that there are many ways where it could complement rather than replace existing human skills and be, you know, a tool that people will it'll make people richer and happier, give them more opportunities. So I think we need to be a little bit careful in not prematurely trying to hobble developments in this area.
Obviously, you're very actively engaged in trying to figure out a policy for this. Do you share that broadly optimistic, laissez-faire view?
It's still going to take some time to understand whether AI is another important technological revolution or whether there's something profoundly different about it from previous ones, which of course was always said about previous technological revolutions. What we've done in Greece is to set up a high-level AI committee advising the Office of the Prime Minister with outstanding scientists about two things. The first is, how can one use as a government AI tools to improve public policy? And there are numerous areas where this can happen. Let me just give you an example. A few days ago, we just ran a test using AI to domestic innovations to help us with identifying wildfires earlier than we could if we were just using our traditional techniques. And of course, there are numerous ways where you can envision AI, being very, very helpful in terms of government policy. So I think every government policy needs to think about whether we can be more effective by using AI. And the second, of course, is, okay, what does this mean for the potential to regulate AI? I would not necessarily want Europe to just be, the chief, regulator of AI, but also to be an innovator in its own right. We have many companies in Greece that are actively doing interesting work in the AI space. The single market is still not working as we would like it to be in order of giving access to these companies to 400+ million consumers, and that's something we need to think about. Why is it that we don't have enough companies that quickly manage to grow? On the other hand, we find ourselves in a very sort of unique space where the power essentially is with 5 or 6 or 7 large corporations. And when we think about the models of multilateral cooperation that we were, the professors were teaching us when we were in college, it always involves state actors. Now you have non-state actors. Plus you have malign state actors who will definitely use AI for misinformation. You can only imagine how easy it will be in a polarized political discourse to start adding, deep fakes and these sort of things which are already there, and then the distinction between truth and lies is going to become that much more difficult. So, what does this mean for the democratic discourse and the public space? We already know the impact of echo chambers in terms of driving sort of our own supporting our own ideas. That will become worse before it becomes better, and the tech companies have an obligation to go above and beyond and to ensure that they will do whatever they can for this not to happen to the extent that we fear it will.
I think this is going to have to be the last question in the interest of time, but can I lead on from there perhaps to ask you, we're sitting here in the cradle of culture in Greece, and culture is under pressure in many ways as never before, partly through technologies, not just AI, but other communications technologies, and it's being weaponized as never before, and we see that in the Middle East. So the question is, can culture survive and thrive in this environment, Western culture, the culture that is dear to people in this room, I'm sure? Start with you, perhaps, Professor Fukuyama.
Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by culture. One question is, can high culture survive? And that's something I don't have a strong opinion about. But there's another aspect to culture which has to do with basically the structure of society, the way we relate to one another. And I think that that is really at the core of a lot of the fights that we are having. And I think probably one of the biggest changes, cultural changes that's taken place over the last 50 years really has to do with the status of women. And I think that if you look at American politics, a lot of what is driving polarization, and also on the part of populist parties in Europe, is kind of male anxiety about being displaced, in the economic role that men had grown up in previous generations to expect. By the way, this is one of the positive impacts of technology that we don't often think about. In a world where everybody is sitting behind a computer screen rather than digging a ditch or lifting heavy machinery, women just do better. And so it's natural that millions, hundreds of millions of women have entered the workforce in advanced economies because of this kind of technological change. It's brought a huge amount of equality, but it's also produced a backlash. And I think that dealing with that backlash is one of the it's become an intimate part of our politics, and we've got to figure out, how to deal with it better than we have.
Well, I don't know if I can offer anything meaningful to what is a very sort of complicated topic, but let me just say that what we define as cultural wars can be extremely dangerous because they draw new dividing line and new cleavages where they didn't necessarily exist. And I think one of the challenges is to find unifying counterforces. Healthy patriotism, which is something you've written about, is, in my mind, to the extent that the nation state will continue to be the dominant, actor in the international scheme, in my mind, is a unifying force. You can have multiple identities. You can be a proud Greek. You can be, a proud European. You can be proud about your local place of origin, and they don't necessarily need to compete or be in constant conflict with each other. Of course, that is easier said than done, but it is very, very easy to create new dividing lines because you will always find an audience, and because negative news and negative speech travels faster than positive speech. The challenge for us is to find unifying themes, and that is not always easy in our complicated world, but certainly an obligation which I personally take very seriously.
Well, with that philosophical thought, I think we have to draw it to close. Thank you both very much for a fascinating conversation. And I could just say that we look forward to being back. We will definitely be back next year for the 28th Government Roundtable to check up on all these issues. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for a very good moderation.
Just have a quick photograph.